All right, I think we can go ahead and get moving. So, number one, appreciate everyone taking the time to jump on this. Thank you very much. I do want to remind everyone we're doing this once a month. This is something we're going to be doing the first Friday of every month, all the way through February. So we've got a whole set of different talk tracks that we've worked with the Palo Alto team, Eric Rosen and Rodney Fisher to help us create. If anyone would like us to sign them up for future sessions, I'd like to encourage you to just pop that in the chat window. We've had some folks that responded on some of the past sessions saying, hey, just go ahead and sign me up for all the rest of them, and we can definitely do that. I also want to emphasize, this whole series is really about enablement, education. We want to give people some good hands-on training. And if you have questions as we're going through this, if there's certain things you want to see, maybe a use case you've got in your environment that you're having some challenges with, we strongly encourage you to throw those types of things out. We may have to address them at the end of the presentation, but that's definitely what we're looking for here. So that said, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Punda, our lead network architect here at EITS. Thank you, Jason, for putting this together for us.
Hey, Leo, just a quick question before Jason starts. Did you start the recording?
I did, sir.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Jason, take it away. Thank you.
Certainly, certainly. So thank you all for attending. Hopefully you find this interesting and useful. So as I was putting together material for this webinar, I got to thinking about what type of questions I normally get from people when it comes to Panorama and where some of the confusion lies. And I realized that typically where I see people having issues has nothing to do with things you do inside the Panorama. Honestly, configuration inside the Panorama is reasonably straightforward. Most of the type of stuff you're doing from a change perspective is stuff that you would do just the same as on a firewall. You introduce the idea of templates and device groups to help manage all that, but the actual nuts and bolts of how you configure things is not radically different. Where people always seem to get confused is, why there's different models of Panorama, what they would do, or how to design the actual Panorama deployment itself to be efficient for their environment. And the inherent problem with that is that once you've deployed Panorama, you have it out there, you're using it, you have firewalls going to it, it's in productions where your logging is, it's where you're pulling reports for auditors out of. If you have to go back and change the very nature of how you've deployed this, it's very, very difficult to do. It's not as easy as just throwing something out there and calling it a day. So it's really important to have properly architected and designed how your Panorama is going to have to operate before you ever actually start doing anything with it. So that's really what I'm going to focus on through here, is talking about different models of Panorama and why you would choose one versus the other, but also to walk you through a couple of different scenarios for how you can commonly deploy Panorama, so that when you're looking at this for your environment, maybe you have a pair of firewalls right now that's sitting on the DMZ, and you have legacy checkpoints or legacy ASAs throughout the rest of the environment, and now you're coming in and looking at going through and replacing these with more Palo Altos. Now you're going to be deploying Panorama. How do you properly architect that in a way that's going to make sense for your environment? So first thing I will look at, though, I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I want to look at why you would ever deploy Panorama in the first place. Now, it used to be that I highly recommended people deploy Panorama when they deployed Palo Alto, regardless of what type of firewall it's, where it's going, what the size was, because honestly, trying to take existing firewalls and putting it into Panorama used to be a nightmare. It was very, very difficult. It was prone to failure. There were a lot of issues. Palo Alto has come a long ways into simplifying that. So now if you have existing firewalls and you bring Panorama on, bringing them into Panorama, it's not particularly hard to do. It imports directly in, you set everything up, away you go. It's going to take you, maybe an hour or so of time, depending on how cautious you are about making changes. But it's not terribly complicated. So nowadays, it's not uncommon to see people running firewalls without Panorama, and then, like I mentioned in our scenario here, adding Panorama after the fact. So, to start looking at why you're going to do Panorama, usually it's going to come down to, some things in management and some things from a logging perspective. So for management, really, the number one reason for deploying Panorama in the first place is for consistent security policies. So, if you have multiple firewalls, you want to make sure that you are applying the same level of security across all of them. So you meet all your compliance, you meet all your, security needs in a consistent way. So you don't have unintentional holes throughout your environment. You also tend to deploy it because it simplifies things. Panorama is very much the idea of, configure a piece of code once, reuse many, many times. It just does it from a security perspective. So Panorama has the idea of shared objects. You can have shared network addresses. You can have shared network groups. You can have shared security policies for antivirus and anti-spyware and so on and so forth. And the idea is that you configure this in Panorama one time, and then you can take it and reuse it and apply it across a multitude of firewalls, a multitude of areas, for a multitude of purposes, without having to reinvent the wheel every single time. That also goes back to the idea of keeping things consistent, but it definitely also simplifies your actual time to deployment. If you have 3/4 of what you need for a particular set of firewalls you're deploying that's new, already pre-configured in Panorama, then obviously it's a lot less time for you to turn around from the time you first wire up the firewalls to the time they go into production. And then, Panorama also gives us the idea of baseline configurations. So if you think you have with, using Panorama, you can say, well, here is a baseline that has the very most simple information that everything needs to have. What are my password complexity? Where do I send syslog to? What type of logs do I send? How do I do alerts for critical findings that are in here? Do I send an email to a particular group? By having this baseline, then you can turn around and apply it to all firewalls at once. It makes, maintaining these much, much easier, because if you have to go back and change, for example, let's say you had email alerts that went to a single user because your SOC was a one-man job. So it went to John Doe at company.com. And then all of a sudden you get money to actually build a proper SOC, and now it needs to go to alerts to a separate email. Instead of having to go to every single firewall and change that email profile, you go into your baseline, you change it from Doe J or whatever the email address actually was to alerts, save, commit, push it to the firewalls, move on. From a logging perspective, there's a couple benefits to Panorama. So obviously, it's going to centralize all your logging in one place, so that makes things much easier. It gives you the visibility for troubleshooting when that happens. So let's say you have a multi-tier architecture with your firewalls. And when I say multi-tier, I mean not from a web app data perspective. I'm talking from more physical and logical sites. So let's say, for example, you have a perimeter edge, and then you have a VPN concentrator of some kind. You have a data center firewall that's managing segmentation to the data center, and then you have remote sites that have remote site firewalls. If you're doing the proper zero trust, deny all, permit by exception type of configuration, you're going to wind up with multiple places where you're allowing or disallowing traffic, which means that when the ticket comes in that, oh, hey, this, the user out at one of these branches cannot get to this resource, everything's broken, and this is a high priority. When you want to go troubleshoot that, instead of having to go to every firewall in the chain and look at each of the rules, look at the permits and denies, try to figure out where it might have broken, if you're doing this from Panorama, you do it once, you can see the flow of traffic. You can see, it hit the site firewall. Okay, then it hit the VPN concentrator, it made it through there. Then it hit the data center firewall. Aha, that's where I got blocked. That particular port is not being allowed, or that particular application is not being allowed. The other big use case, more and more for Panorama, is it's the only way you're going to get good visibility for both the firewall and for the endpoint. So if you have an environment where you're deploying the Traps endpoint, Traps has its own management system as ESM that's going to be actually used for managing policies and looking at alerts from that perspective, but it could also send logs into Panorama, which means if you're tracking flows of traffic, you can follow how it passes through your network. Again, think of that multi-tier architecture. It passes through an edge firewall, then it passes through a VPN concentrator, then it passes through a site firewall. Then you can see where it actually makes it down to the endpoint. The file tried to execute, Traps caught it, so on and so forth. So you get that full flow of traffic, and you can see it all in one place. You're not having to go back and forth trying to troubleshoot stuff or trying to track down threats. So let's talk about different models of Panorama. So Panorama has typically always come in two flavors. There's virtualized Panorama and there's physical. Now, in the old days, the physical was the M100 and the M500 appliance. And then now we actually have the M200 and the M600, which have actually superseded them. So even though you will see the 100 and 500 on here for comparison's sake, you're not actually going to buy or deploy a 100 or 500 anymore. So you're really looking at, the 200 and 600 from a physical or a virtual. And in addition to that, the firewall or the Panorama in virtual can actually run in a couple different ways. So the traditional, they call legacy mode now, version of the virtual Panorama use a single disk for logging space and for actual management usage, the operating system. And if you needed additional storage outside the 11 gigs that was on there, you had a couple options. But if you needed a large amount of storage, you're pretty much having to attach an NFS disk to it. There are limitations where you can only attach certain storage. If you're running ESX, if you're running hypervisors, you couldn't do it. More and more, Palo has actually tried taking the virtual Panorama and making it more in line with the physical. So now we have what they call Panorama mode, which allows a local log collector to be attached to it. So it's still a box. You're still attaching storage to it, but you can attach a lot more of it. And logically, it splits out those functions. So instead of having management and logging storage all be intermixed from a disk perspective, it splits those out more like a physical one would be. So there's a couple things you're going to look at when you're picking between the two, and there's some advantages and disadvantages to both. So when you're looking at physical Panorama, the big reason why you typically look at that is the log rates. It can support a lot more logs than the virtual can. It also has dedicated storage. So storage can be very costly. So if your environment is running, EMC VMAX, for example, for storage, your cost per gigabyte or terabyte of data on that storage is going to be fairly high. You could have a lot of negotiations back and forth with your virtualization team on how much storage you need, how much they have available. If you're buying a physical appliance, it's there, you have it, moving on. And it doesn't require virtualization. Now, if you're running something like Palo Alto firewalls, the odds are you have virtualization in your environment. It's just far too prevalent not to have it. But where that can come in handy is if you have places you need, firewalls, you have a large user base, for example, maybe this is corporate headquarters, you have 5,000 users, you're going to generate a fairly large amount of logs, but you may not have any actual virtualized systems at that particular site. It may be all physical domain controller, and so on and so forth. So you wouldn't want to have to deploy virtualization just for the sake of having a virtual Panorama box there. Now, the advantages for the virtual, this is very cost effective. Out the door, just the VM Panorama is very, very cheap. So if you're getting your toes wet with Panorama, either from a management perspective or from a logging perspective, it's a very, very easy way of doing it. That's definitely true if you're in a situation where you are sort of test driving Palo Alto as a whole. Maybe you've only deployed a couple of firewalls and you want to get familiar with Panorama to see whether you're investing more heavily into it in the future. You can do that and it not cost you a great deal. You also have a lot of easy backup options because it's virtualized. You back it up just like you would any other virtual machine. And it definitely simplifies disaster recovery planning. A lot of people don't really think that far into it, but if you think about it, you're going to want to be able to get Panorama up fairly quickly as part of your management process for your firewalls for disaster recovery. At the same time, depending on what type of site you have, you may have a situation where you don't have a lot of physical hardware at the DR site, and maybe you have an agreement to expand that out if you have to run long-term there, for example. At the same time, you're going to have some sort of DR planning in place for your virtualized environment anyways. Maybe you're doing SRM or something like that. So you can integrate this into it so that you can get your Panorama up fairly quickly without having to invest rack space, cooling, and so on and so forth on physical appliance. It's just going to sit there. So, now you start thinking about which Panorama model you want to use. So there's a number of different ways to actually look at this, and there's some very, very complicated formula that can go into looking at all this. But there's a couple things to look at. First of all, you want to look at are your firewalls on-premise or are your firewalls virtual? If you're running a virtual environment and you have VM series firewalls, then it kind of makes sense to actually keep a VM Panorama for your actual management and your logging. There are obviously some efficiencies you're going to gain if you have everything virtualized. On the flip side, if your firewalls are all on-premise, then you have to start looking at, if you're throwing log after log after the virtual Panorama, you start actually thinking about how your virtual environment connects. What sort of switching is in place? What are the limitations the compute stack it's running off of, so that when you start looking at what logs you're bringing in and everything else, you're having to share that with all the other traffic in the environment. Another consideration would be if you have a dedicated out-of-band management network. That is a common suggestion, if not out requirement, for a lot of compliance stuff to have out-of-band management. And all the physical firewalls, of course, have their management interface. So if you have all that, then you want to be able to enable that logging to stay within that management network and deploy a physical Panorama in there. Next thing you want to look at is it being used for management, logging, or both? And it definitely makes a difference when it comes to log ingestion rate in particular. So if it's having to spend CPU cycles for management and for logging, the truth of the matter is it's going to take in less logs than a box that is doing nothing but collecting logs over and over and over again. And you can see over here the Panorama log ingestion rate chart I've got sitting here. You can see there is some substantial differences between the two. 10,000 logs per second in a mixed environment on the M200 versus 28,000 if it's a dedicated collector is a fairly sizable change in how things go. So, with that in mind, that's going to also change your sizing requirements and everything else. That also goes into your logs per second coming out of the firewall. You also have to think about how much data needs to be stored and for how long. And like I said, there's some complex calculations. There's a wonderful page there as part of the live community. And just as a sidebar, if you've not spent time looking through Palo Alto's live community, I highly encourage it. Palo Alto has good admin documentation, but if you're looking for answers to questions, you're more likely to find an answer through the live community than you will through digging through pages of documentation. It may be there, it may not, but there's a lot of supplementary material, if you want to look at it that way, that goes into the live community, and it's an active community where it's constantly getting updated for new firmware, new hardware, so on and so forth. So there is one out there that actually breaks down the formula, but essentially you're looking at the average log retention versus how much per day, and then figuring out based on your log quotas how much it's going to work out to be, and then from that you have to tie it into your own requirements for how much you want to keep at any given time. The log ingestion rate still, though, is going to be the #1 way you're going to size these. And you can see from the chart on the far right here, different models have different logs that they'll max out at. And then do bear in mind, we're talking maximum. So this is maximum ingestion. This is maximum output from the firewall. The reality is your environment may or may not come anywhere close to maximum. And you have multiple reasons for why you may choose a particular firewall. So for example, if you're throwing 5250s out there, you may be doing it because you have 100 gig interfaces that you want to hook up. That does not mean that you're actually generating 55,000 logs per second. You may be generating 15,000 logs per second, depending on your environment. So if you have the ability to get that off of a legacy system, or you can pull that off of existing Palo Altos you've deployed, if you're doing this in a case where you have the firewalls already in place, and then you're going to do Panorama, or if you have a SIM out there, QRadar, Splunk, Logarithm, all of those have ways of going back and looking at the logs that they have ingested from certain logging sources. That can be really, really handy for actually scoping this out. So your worst case scenario would be, I don't know what the existing log rate is. I have to assume max, and this is where that chart would come into play. There's also some non-technical reasons why you might consider different models of Panorama. A big one is data compliance requirements. So depending on what your data compliance requirements are, you may be required to keep logs physically in one location or the other. So for example, you may have a compliance requirement that says these logs must stay within the country that they are generated. If that's the case, you can't be shipping them, to a log collector or to a Panorama box that's a log collector or a mixed mode that's off in a different country. You have to maintain it with that actual log source. So in a situation like that, you may deploy multiple Panoramas, not because you need the storage and not because the log rate is so high that you have to, as much as it is that you need to meet those compliance requirements of maintaining the integrity of the data within the country of generation. Another one that I've encountered from time to time is physical management separation. Now you may think, now why do I need to worry about that? Well, we have customers that are based around different lines of business, and a lot of that line of business work is based off of contracts. And it's fairly common in that contract for it to be written in a way that, should the contracting party need to break the contract, either because they choose not to renew it or because of, some reason why they're not happy with the people, they have the right to pool their data and they have the right to pool their hardware. And as part of that, it's not uncommon to just maintain separate physical hardware for them in that situation, because you don't want to be stuck trying to untangle their parts from other parts. So they may have their own dedicated firewall, at which point you'd also give them their own dedicated Panorama box. So if 2 years from now the contract ends and they have to take their stuff out, it's just a matter of unplugging it and taking it. It's not doesn't require a lot of change to the other lines of business that are not moving out. So let's look at a couple different deployment models. So this is the very common one that you see more than anything else. Maybe you have a single Panorama box. It could be physical. It could be virtual. That could be M200. That could be an M600. All the firewalls are going to be managed by it. And it's also going to take all the logs in. It's going to do this across multiple sites. So you can see we've broken out user firewalls, edge, and 2 different data centers. Maybe user and edge and data center 1 are all in the same physical location, and data center 2 is a HA site. But still, it's the same box or same pair that's actually managing and logging everything. And this certainly works if the log rate is small enough that it's not an issue. Something to keep in mind with all of these, regardless of the deployment model, is that Panorama is not designed to be your long-term archival solution for logging. There's a reason why the QRadars and the Splunks of the world are out there. So your log retention rate here in a situation like this, maybe you only need 3 days, because 3 days is as much as your troubleshooting typically, and everything is shipped off the bat. So you can get away with doing it that way. Or maybe you just have that low log retention rate where it doesn't really matter. The second one that we encounter a lot, now we split purposes out. So we have our Panorama management, HA pair, and then we have multiple log collectors that we're splitting out for different purposes. So in this situation, let's say we have one that maintains our active data center firewalls, one for our secondary data center firewalls, which might be somewhere across the country, and then a third one that is picking in our edge firewalls and our user firewalls and all of our smaller site firewall type stuff going into it. In a situation like this, the firewalls are going to log directly into the log collector they're assigned to. That could be a single box. That could also be a collector group. So in the case of a collector group, you might have, for example, let's say we had an M200 as our management, and then we had a log collector group with M600s for the data centers. It's going to write to one, and it's going to buffer over to another. So if one log collector goes down, there's still a record. The firewall keeps writing. Life is still good. The management is going to come off all of those from the HA pair. So you're still going to manage them from the same single point, just as you would as if the logging were going to them directly. And then when you go to do all your reporting, what essentially happens is that management pair will reach down to those data collectors, run your queries, gather your reports, whatever you need, and present them to you. The actual data itself, the logs gathered, stay on that collector. So again, we mentioned a moment ago compliance requirements that dictate, data staying with the source in the same source country or in the same source continent. This is an example where you can have that management spread out across multiple locations, but the data still stays at its origination point. So that integrity is still kept. There are a lot of different ways to slice this up, but I did want to show one more that's just kind of interesting. This is called the follow the sun for management. So in this scenario, we have firewalls deployed in the US and we have firewalls over in EMEA. So we have one pair for management. And, we'll say that one of those is sitting there in Santa Clara on the US side, and one is over in Cork on the EMEA side. And as you can see, there's, depending on daylight savings time, there's either 7-hour, 8-hour offset between those two sites. So what happens is each of those management boxes has the ability to manage all the firewalls. So the PAN management in Santa Clara can manage all the firewalls in the US. It can manage all the firewalls in EMEA. There's a log collector that collects all the file or the logs there in the US that all the firewalls report to. And then there's a log collector in the EMEA that all the firewalls there report to. And once again, both management pair can do reporting off of one or the other. So what you would do in that situation is the management Palo or Panoramas, you would fail back and forth depending on which team was active. So for example, if it's daytime there in Cork, then they fail over. You make that one the active unit. So now they're accessing locally for doing other reporting, other threat hunting, other searching, so on and so forth. They can still manage issues in the US should something come up, but they're, odds are they're probably making changes that are going to be more local to their environments, and they have that local access to it. Then, they finish their shift. By the time they finish their shift, it's right about the same time the Santa Clara shift comes on board. They fail the firewall's over. Now it's the active firewall. It can manage everything. All the logging still goes to the data collectors. It can still do all of its reports. If something happens between shifts, then whichever one is actually active is where you would go to actually manage things. But this is a way you're still keeping that same centralized management plane. You're not having to have US do one set of management and EMEA do a different set of management, but you're empowering the local teams so they're not having to go back and forth transcontinental for every little thing they're doing. So that said, I was going to drop out of here. We're going to do something a little interesting, I think. So the one thing I have not mentioned at any point here, quite intentionally, is cloud. So Palo Alto has come a long ways with what they're doing for their cloud deployments as well. So everything you can do currently, you can do in the cloud. So we're going to pop over here to Azure. We're going to deploy Panorama in Azure really quick. So you can see that it's identical to what you would do normally. The Azure firewalls at this point with 8.1, same idea as what we just went through. You can have dedicated management. You can have dedicated log collectors. You could be using them just like you would otherwise. So if you had a need where you centralize everything, or if you have a cloud environment you're building out, this can be really powerful for you, and it's very easy to actually set up and deploy. So we're going to come over here. First thing we're going to do, we're just going to add a virtual machine in here. So we want Panorama. It does support your typical licensing. In this use case, we're using BYOL just for simplicity's sake. It tells us this is our bring your own license enable version. Cool. We're going to go ahead and create it. Oops, my mistake.
And guys, while Jason's getting this deployed here, one thing I do want to comment on, and this is Leo Chavez, Director of Consulting Service at EITS, is over the past 6 to 8 months, we've been getting involved in a lot more cloud deployments. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot of is customers are deploying right out of the marketplace like Jason is right now. And, it's quick, it's easy. You get in, you get out. One area where we've been able to really help organizations out and show a lot of value is going back through and looking at more of an enterprise licensing agreement type scenario. One of the things we find with cloud is, one of the biggest benefits out there, especially when we start talking about the firewall side, is the ability to scale dynamically, the ability to deploy additional firewalls or track different firewalls. And another thing we're seeing a lot of is customers wanting to move from one cloud provider to another one. So being able to, move all their data because they could save some money if they go over to Amazon this month versus Google Cloud next month. And that's where, not obtaining the licenses through the marketplace and actually, buying your own through Palo or doing an ELA can really be a huge benefit as well. So go ahead, Jason, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Sure. So as you can see, I'm just filling out fairly basic stuff here. There is design documentation on Palo's website that gives you sizing requirements depending on what model firewall what purpose Panorama you're deploying. I'm just deploying one for simple management real quick here. So you can tell it's going to use something pretty standard. It's going to be D3, V2. I've chosen hard drives here because it's just for management or just for test purposes. You could also pick SSD sizing if you really had the need for it. Obviously, this has consequences when it comes to your pricing, but for this purpose, it's perfectly fine. So we're going to select that we want our D3 V2, which gives us 4 VPUs. The minimum requirement for this for management only for Azure is going to be 4 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM, and 81 gigs of local storage. This meets a lot of our requirements, and it's a very, very common Azure sizing. So we're not going to set availability sets here. That would be something we would do if we were deploying multiple and we were doing HA. Really quick, the main purpose behind that is you have to think infrastructure. You're turning your infrastructure over to Microsoft. You're trusting them to maintain it and keep everything up and running and so on and so forth. But you can still help yourself out with that a bit by having availability sets. Basically, you're trying to set things up in a way where each of your virtual Azure panoramas are running with different power, different cooling, different all underlying physical infrastructure. So when Microsoft has to take something down, you're not affected. HA still works. In this case, we don't care about it. We're going to come in here. I don't care about setting up my own disk management. I'm perfectly fine letting Azure handle it. Deploy a virtualized network. We're going to let it sit here on the 10. We could customize this. It's going to assign a new public IP address because I don't have one for it at the moment. Auto shutdown is really handy. Maybe not so much for Panorama, but you can configure auto shutdown to actually shut VMs down at a certain time. So I can set, say, hey, 7 o'clock UTC time, shut this VM off. Turn on diagnostic monitoring. Registering with Azure Active Directory, I'm not going to really get into it here, but that ties in depending on what you're deploying with high availability or with some Azure management stuff. So we're just going to take this pretty much at default. For this purposes, we don't really care. Now it's going to do a validation of our settings. And it's going to point out, some important things here. This is going to be our pricing from a virtual perspective. BYOL, so I don't have a license to Azure for it. You go to Palo Alto, or you go to a partner like us to actually get all that licensing, or you're using your enterprise licensing like Leo was just mentioning. Contact information, I tell it to create. And you can see over here, it has now submitted this for deployment. Deployment can take anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 minutes. So what I did is I actually went through and deployed one of these previously this morning, just to give you an idea. So here's one I've got that's sitting out here. I believe I have it powered on.
And while Jason's pulling that up, one other thing I'll hit on real quick on that the HA configuration he showed a second ago. If you're dealing with production environment, always make sure you check that. Azure does down. If you do not deploy HA and you go down, they will basically say tough. So when you're dealing with production data, it's when you want to make sure you're checking.
Yeah. So here we go. So like I said, I don't have a license on this box. I just deployed it before we started this webinar, and I'll be blowing it away when we get done. So I'm not going to license it. But you can see just through the background here, it's your standard Panorama box. As soon as you deploy a device license to it, then it will come through here. You'll have your device groups and your templates, and you'll operate off of it just like you would any other type of Panorama. At the moment, by default, you can see here, this says management only. If I can make this go away. There we go, complete manually. Since this doesn't have a license, it can't pull one back off the server. Here's the information you would actually put into your support portal in order to get the licensing. Theoretically, you'd already have the serial number that would apply to this. Let's see if I can embiggen this. Give me just a second here. There we go. So you can see here we have our system mode as management only. If we had deployed a different model, we could do something differently with it. But it's Panorama, just like you know and love. It's just running in the cloud. The one thing I missed pointing out while Leo was discussing enterprise licensing is at the moment I let this just apply a public IP to it, and that's perfectly fine for our test purposes. In reality, you will actually want to go in there and statically assign a IP to it, since obviously you don't want the public IP changing. We do have a couple options once we get into it. So let's come over here to our virtual machine. So we can configure a DNS name. So if you're accessing everything by name, you can do that through Azure's DNS, at which point it's going to give you a Azure qualified domain. You can point it to internal DNS, or not internal, but to a public DNS as well if you have that running. You can see over here, prefer to use your own name. You can use this. If I were to assign it a name right now, and you can see our VM we just deployed is already done. So like I said, it normally does not take very long. It depends on the resources, where you're deploying it. Right now we're deploying it in central US just for easy deployment. So we're just going to close that. We can set over here, we can set our dynamic IP. We can give it a static IP.
Hey, Jason, can you zoom in just a little bit?
Let's see here. I believe so. Yeah,
Thanks.
that's as big as I can make it. So we can statically assign the same IP to it. We don't. It could be perfectly fine. We can set our idle timeouts, and again, we can give it our DNS name, which is going to be whatever I name it at centralus.cloudapp.azure.com. But again, you can put your own domain names in there. That becomes really important when you start putting certificates on there, since you want to make sure that your certificate has the right name so everything is trusted correctly. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Like I said, you can see it is up and running at that point. So we could go ahead and start managing firewalls with it right now as soon as we throw a license on it, just that quickly. I mean, it's really the fastest way you can get Panorama out there. So that's actually really all I've got at the point. Hopefully we got some questions to go through.
Great job, Jason. Thank you. Yeah, so if anyone out there has any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A window or the chat window, and any scenarios you may be trying to test in your environment or hurdles you may be hitting. One other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to share the upcoming webinars we're going to be having and show you guys a list of those.
Oh, hold on just a second before you do it, Leo. I forgot I did have it pulled up here. I mentioned previously, as we were going through this, that there is documentation on the live community that really gets into sizing. And you can find this, just DuckDuckGo Panorama Sizing Design Guide, and you'll be able to pull this up pretty straightforward. Like I said, I want to be efficient with our time and not go through all this, but you can see it walks you through the calculations, has a breakdown of why you use different timers, how log buffering works. So if you are doing a very detailed, high-level architecture for Panorama, I highly encourage you to take a look at this. Like I said, it's right here on Palo Alto's own live network site. So take it away, Leo.
All right, so here we go. You able to see my screen here? You see the table I got up? All right, cool. So everyone on the horn, these are the next sessions we're going to be having. So as you can see, the next couple here, we're going to start getting into some fun stuff. We're going to start talking cloud. We're going to go through a lot of what we see going on in the industry today. We've had some very interesting cases over the past couple of months around cloud with organizations that started making some big leaps toward the cloud, and things like security kind of came as an after fact. So we're going to talk through some of the gotchas we've seen and how folks can prepare for those, and also run through some hands-on deployment scenarios. After that, we're going to be getting into some traps, talking a little bit about Palo Alto's Traps endpoint protection solution, getting into some malware blocking and analysis using autofocus. So getting into some more advanced threat hunting type activities. Next, we've got SSL decryption. That's going to be a really good one. That's another big gap we see in the industry right now, where reality is most things that we see getting through tend to be coming through encrypted. From there, data center segmentation, and we're going to start talking about introducing some virtual firewalls and integration with NSX, and then we're going to end with Aperture and how you could protect your SaaS data that lives out in Google Drive or Box or whatever you may be using in your organization. So if anyone is interested in attending any of these sessions, it's as easy as typing in the chat window which session numbers you want us to register for, and we will register you for those. Or you are welcome to shoot me an email. My email address is chavezl@EITS.com, and we can sign you up for whichever sessions you'd like. And if you'd like us to go ahead and sign you up for all of them, we can do that. You will get a reminder the morning before the session that it's coming up. So yeah, if anyone has any questions at this point, we'd love to hear them. Awesome, good. Yeah, and all of these sessions get recorded and they get tossed out on our YouTube channel. I've got the link to that in the bottom of my email signature. So if any of you got an email from me about this session coming up, I can also pop that off in the chat window right now. So you guys have that. Bear with me one sec here. There we go. Yeah, so I'm putting this in the chat window. I'm going to chat it out to everybody, but this is our YouTube channel where we are posting all these videos to. So, if you got peers or, other folks you're working with on your team that aren't able to make it, or if you're not able to make any given session, we'll get these posted out here over the weekend after the session. So I'll save the recording, we'll get it tossed out there, and we'll have it out there by Monday. Unless anyone has any other questions, we really appreciate everyone's time. I know time is the most valuable commodity we all have. We really hope you guys are finding value in these sessions and they're helping enable you in your environment. So thank you all very much for the time. We greatly appreciate it. Jason, great job on the presentation. Thank you very much.
You are most welcome.
All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to close it out. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.